Today, we're joined by Jon Kennedy from Evo. Thanks for joining us. First things first, tell us a little about yourself and your history with mountain biking in the Pacific Northwest.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Boris, for sure. My history with mountain biking in the Pacific Northwest is really dated back to as far as I can remember. I started out, obviously, a kid in the suburbs of Renton, riding my BMX bike around and getting back into the forest behind our neighborhoods when we had time, and then hit high school, and bikes weren't quite as cool as cars, and took a bit of a hiatus there. But after moving out of my place, quickly got back into riding, which first started kind of just getting around the streets and neighborhoods where I lived, and then quickly was turned on to trail riding back in the mid to late 90s. So I've been doing it for quite a while. And then, was kind of at a position in my life in the early 2000s. Was kind of at that critical juncture where I'm like, okay, well, do I just go try and find something else? I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do. And, or do I follow this path of right livelihood, which is really kind of, investing myself in the things that I'm passionate about. I called this guy, by the name of Kurt Fikroyd, and Kurt was the trek wreck at the time. Kurt, was very gracious with me, especially a guy just calling him out of the blue. And I said, hey, I'm really interested in being in the bike industry, and I don't have any experience. I don't know what I'm doing. I can ride a bike. I can work on my bike. But beyond that, I got nothing. What do I do? But I gave it a go and figured I'd give it a shot and see where it landed me. And so that was, I think 2003, 2004-ish. I worked at Greg Cycles up at Green Lake for a bit. And then wound up getting introduced to, at that time, was called the Backcountry Bicycle Trails Club, or BBTC, which is now Evergreen Mountain Bike Alliance. And they were looking for a volunteer coordinator. And so I applied for the position and got it, and was doing kind of part-time with both jobs. And from there, kind of worked my way up through various positions within the company, within the organization. I was at Evergreen. I was the second employee there. Worked my way up to executive director. I did that for a short bit, and then wound up taking a position with Diamondback Bikes as the marketing manager. I did that for almost 6 years, and then had an opportunity to come to Evo, and Evo was just getting into the bike segment. That's kind of my history in a nutshell.
Cool. So tell us a bit about Evo.
Well, Evo is, I'm probably going to get smacked in the face, but I think we're pushing 20 years now, or close to it. It was founded and started by Bryce Phillips, who's our founder and CEO. Bryce was a pro skier at the time and had some good connections, both here and up at Whistler, and was able to leverage those connections to get some used and closeout gear. And, one thing led to another, and I think it was a few years before 2010 that they opened their first store in Fremont, which served as our headquarters for a number of years after that. We then opened the Seattle location at 35th and Stone, which most people are familiar with nowadays. Portland, Denver, soon to be Salt Lake City, 5 locations in Whistler all came after that. So the expansion over the last 10 years has been phenomenal.
All right. So we'll move on into the other questions now. So the first one has to do with categories of mountain bikes. So you've got like cross country, trail, enduro, downhill, all these different categories. But how do those apply to the Pacific Northwest? And if somebody's just getting into mountain biking, what would you suggest they get?
Okay, so that is a really great question. I think that what I would first refer to, and I mean, don't mean to keep plugging Evo, but, we've got a great mountain bike guide that kind of helps to answer some of those questions, right? Getting a good sense of like, where are you going to be riding? How long have you been doing this? What's your experience? Where would you like to be in the next couple of years? So, right, like maybe getting them into a product or a bike that allows them room for growth. I think of XC as your lesser travel, probably lighter weight, a little bit stiffer. Your enduro downhill bikes are going to give you a lot more forgiveness, but probably not as much, feel or contact with the trail as you might experience on a hardtail or an XC bike. And then your all mountain trail bikes are going to be somewhere in the middle there. And so I think for the Northwest, a trail bike or an all mountain bike is probably what most people need. A lot of it is very subjective, but I think the key takeaway is that, whether it's at the store in Evo or your local bike shop, whoever that is, that staff is valuable, and they've got the experience and the training to be able to help guide you towards that right purchase. And if they're well trained in order to do so, I would probably recommend that people take advantage of that.
Let's say, I'll use myself and pretend I don't mountain bike, but I want to. Like, I've got an 11-year-old son. He wants to get a mountain bike and he wants to get out there, and I want to go out there with him. I don't really know the trails. I heard something about a place called Duthie. What kind of bike would you recommend for me?
Great question. So first off, kids bikes. Let's tackle that first, right? And that's one I'm intimately familiar with. I've got 2 kids that are teenagers right now, so we're at that point where they're moving up into different bikes now. And I would tell a parent first off that anticipate that you're going to go through a number of bikes with your child, right? Your kid's going to outgrow your bike in probably a year to year and a half to 2 years. So your investment in your bike is obviously largely going to be dependent on your financial situation, how much you want to invest in that, and what your needs are for your child. In most situations, not all, I think most kids are probably better off being steered towards a hardtail or a more economically valued bike than, a full suspension. Most kids' full suspension bikes right now, on average, are probably going to land you in the $1,500 to $1,600 range. And that's a lot of money to bite off for a bike that you're going to have for a year and a half, 2 years, right? Especially when your resale value is going to be a fair amount less than that. I've had my kids on hardtails for a number of years and really felt that it was important for them to learn how to ride a hardtail mountain bike with flat pedals before they get into a full suspension, before they clip in, right? I think there's techniques that you learn on a hardtail that you're going to miss if you go straight to a full suspension or if you go straight to clipped in. I do think that a lot of kids' bikes these days come with suspension that's fairly subpar. I don't feel that it really does much of anything besides give them the look of having a suspension bike, mm-hmm. right? There's not a lot of there's none of the bells and whistles that you get on some of the nice suspension bikes unless you really bump up in price. And so in those situations when people are like, hey, this bike's got a suspension fork on the front, a lot of times I'll tell them, hey, you might actually want to explore going with a bike with maybe a wider profile tire on it, something with the a 2.8 or a 3.0. That's going to give you a little bit of cushion, which is really what you're looking for if you actually want to utilize the suspension, which is a little bit of forgiveness to help absorb some of the shocks, rocks, roots, things that you're rolling over. You might be more apt to go that route and get them, not necessarily a fat bike, but a plus size bike over a bike with a subpar fork on it.
Yeah. So then switching, kind of focusing more like on the adult side, if I'm an adult, I'm going to do it maybe once or twice a month. What sort of bike would I be looking at? Full suspension, hardtail for an adult? What would you suggest?
Well, a full suspension bike, I think, gives you a bit more flexibility in a lot of things, and I think in many situations, it's for a lot of people quite possibly a more enjoyable ride. We all, I'm guessing you and myself as well, right? We were riding early in the days when suspension was relatively new, and it was pretty bone jarring at times, and not necessarily the greatest experience ever, but it worked, right? And we did a great job there. I think for parents who are looking to get into a bike, I try to figure out, like you said, where they intend to ride, where they hope to ride, what kind of riding they see themselves doing, right? Like, what is this image? If you're a new rider, you haven't done it before, what is this image you have in your head of riding? Like, why are you here in the first place, right? Did you see Red Bull Rampage on NBC and you're like, that looks super cool, I'm into that? That's probably going to it's going to invoke a lot more questions on my end for sure. But I think for most parents, a relatively short travel full suspension bike is more than enough. Like I said, I think people tend to overgun themselves on suspension a lot of times. It's not necessarily a bad thing, especially in the Pacific Northwest where we don't have flat, buffed out trails everywhere, right? There is roots and rocks and hills, and there's some steep stuff, and that extra suspension in a lot of cases can provide a feeling of a safety net, and that's not a bad thing. So if somebody's like, hey, I'm only going to ride Duthie once a week with my kid, I'm looking for a 6-inch bike. Well, you can absolutely do that, and you'll probably have a great time on it. Do you need that? Absolutely not. And so kind of letting them know, hey, a shorter travel, 100 mil or what, really a 120 mil, 130 mil is likely more than most people need. I think I'm a fairly aggressive rider, and to be honest, I don't think in most situations I need more than 120, 130 myself. Now, I'm riding a bike with a little bit more suspension than that, but is it necessary? Not always.
Another one I'm going to ask that would be more helpful if we actually had a person testing this out is, how do I know if a bike fits? Like, what are the things that I want to look for to make sure it fits for me properly?
Yeah, it's interesting because I was talking about this with somebody recently, and it almost seems a little bit harder these days to get somebody accurately on a bike, in terms of fit than it used to be, right? It used to be fairly straightforward where it's like, hey, if you're X tall or your inseam is X amount, you need a bike with generally this size of a top tube, right? Top tube length in terms of bike fit these days is kind of out the door. It's not necessarily applicable anymore because it's not a straight linear line from A to B anymore. There's other factors in terms of the geo, especially when you're talking about bikes with more modern geometry, which are much more complex than your standard triangle bikes from 20 years ago, right? And so, when we're talking about bike fit, I think the safe bet here is to use stack and reach. Seems to be the most appropriate means. Now, if you tell somebody, hey, what's your stack and what's your reach? Like, I think most riders don't know where they fall in that line, right? And so that's difficult. So generally, if I'm talking like brand noob, somebody, fresh to the whole thing, I'd say, well, let's start with standover, because if the standover doesn't work, nothing else is going to work, right? Like that's an absolute right there. From standover, there's a lot of tweaks that we can make to the rest of the bike to get you in the ballpark, right? So, and even before standover, I think the first thing you do is say, if we can identify what bikes or, even a few different bikes that you want, we can use height as a gauge. But every manufacturer is going to have suggested sizes for their size charts. If you're between 5'6" and 5'10", you should probably be on a medium. But the tricky part, right, is that if you're 5'8" to 6'1", you need to be in a large. And they're like, wait a minute, I'm 5'9", so you're saying I need a medium and a large. That can be complicated, right? And I think if you decide to downsize on a bike, which you could do if you want to go with the medium because you're 5'9", then the bike will probably feel a little bit more nimble and lively and maneuverable on trail. If you go upper, you're the size larger for your fit. It's probably going to feel a little bit more stable, but maybe not quite as nimble underneath. Start with the size guides from the manufacturer as a starting place. That's a great place to start. That at least gets you in the ballpark. From there, we would test out the bikes and see, does the standover work for you? Yes. Okay, great. There's variables that we can change between the cockpit, the stem, the bar height, up and down, stem length, saddle, forward or back, up or down, and angle to get you in the ballpark where you want to be. There is no absolute in this. Again, it's like we're still on the spectrum thing. There is no absolute, and a lot of it's going to be trial and error. You can be, yep, this feels great. I feel good. My wife is a perfect example of that. I just got her an e-bike. She feels really good on it, and within the first 2 weeks, she's having a little bit of pain up in her shoulder. Her palms kind of hurt. And it's like, okay, well, now we're in trial and error mode. Let's move your seat forward just a little bit. Can we get any other additional spacers underneath your stem to raise your bars up a little bit? Let's try that. And there's some trial and error. So hopefully, in most cases, you have somebody that's comfortable making those adjustments on their own. If they're not, the shop is there to help you with that. And at that point, they're very easy. Changes that can be made to kind of dial that in. But, are you ever going to be like, this is exactly where I'm at? Unless you get a professional bike fit from a trained bike fitter, it's always just going to be a very, very subjective thing.
So thinking about the trails that we tend to have around here, I know for myself, I'm always right between two sizes, pretty much for every manufacturer. If somebody finds himself in that, you mentioned that if they go a size down a little bit, the bike's gonna be a little more nimble. and if they size up a little bit, the bike might be a little more stable. Thinking about our trails, which one would you pick? Which one would you go with?
I am that guy. I'm 5'10", so I tend to fall right in that medium-large spectrum. I can ride both bikes fairly comfortably with just some minor tweaks to the cockpit. In 9.9 times out of 10, I go medium when I could go large, right? And I do so because I like to play around on the bike. I like to dance around on trail. I like to pop off little things on the side. That to me is really fun. I feel like I have more control over a bike like that, and I can move around on the bike a lot more than if I've got something a bit larger. So obviously, I mean, I can ride a large, and it doesn't necessarily feel bad to me. I mean, I can absolutely get away with a large, but the medium gives me that sense of playfulness.
You mentioned a little bit earlier about finding a price of a bike that's somewhere in the middle. It's a pretty good size range. I mean, you get department store bikes that are super cheap, and then you get, full carbon everything bikes, with tons of travel and all that. Maybe start with this question. How cheap is too cheap?
These days, that's a tough question, man.
So let's say hardtail, 120 mil travel bike, something like that. How cheap is too cheap for that?
So there's a couple of questions I need to ask you before I answer that. Are we talking a brand new bike, full MSRP? Are we talking a bike at closeout discounted price? And are we talking about a used bike, right? All of those things need to be taken into consideration because that's going to change things drastically.
For sure. So for this situation, let's pick a bike that is brand new MSRP. Brand new
MSRP. So rule of thumb for me is I won't ever tell anybody a bike is too cheap, right? I think that depending on the manufacturer, I'll use a couple of examples. There are manufacturers like Giant who they own their own factories. They're darn near vertical businesses, meaning that they even own some of the they mine some of the organic materials out of the ground that they use to create their bikes, right? So when you've got your own factory, you've got your own materials that you're sourcing, a lot of the components that you have are exclusively yours. The cost of your product is going to come way down, right? One of the questions I get asked all the time is like, why would I pay $10,000 for a mountain bike? I can buy a motorcycle for that. Well, the motorcycle industry in many cases is damn near vertical too, right? Meaning that they produce their own components and whatnot. Most bike companies these days do not produce their own components. They produce frames, and then they use third-party components to put on those bikes. And so your cost is incrementally always going to go up there. Now, people like Giant, who have a little bit more control over that, can generally offer sometimes better price points on bikes than others. Depending on the scale of your company. Somebody like Specialized or Trek or Giant or Cannondale, like the big guys, are going to be able to offer better value because the scale of their companies is so much bigger than somebody like an Evil or a Revel or a Transition, right? And so those things need to be taken into account. Not all bikes are going to be priced the same for what you're getting on them. So to go back to the original question was what price is too little for a bike. As a rule of thumb, I generally tell people, hey, on a hardtail with just front suspension on it, maybe $800 at the very, very inexpensive low end, on up to, let's say more accurately, probably $1,000, $1,200 is probably a good starting point. For a full suspension bike, you're going to be probably in most cases hard pressed to get into anything under $1,500, $1,600, $1,700. Obviously, there's always going to be exceptions to the rules here, but those are good starting places. There's going to be more value oriented bikes on the hardtail side than there is full suspension for the obvious reasons. There's less components. You don't have an additional shock on a hardtail like that. That makes sense. I tend to go more towards the spec on the bike and look at that, right? Like what is spec'd on the bike? What rear derailleur are they running? What crankset? And what if it has a fork, what fork is it? What wheel set are you using, right? Those to me tell me more necessarily than a price point does. I would not feel comfortable recommending that somebody take their, department store bike out to a trail to do things. Depending on the situation, they could probably get away with it just fine. but it's not intended for that. It's not built for that.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think the guardrails are good, and actually it's interesting you picked 800 for the low end hardtail. That's kind of the number that's been in my mind too for that. But definitely components are something to look at, because there are times where something can have a really fancy rear derailleur, and then the rest of the components are actually low end. It's like, oh, it's got XT, and then it's like got these brakes that can't slow me down worth a darn.
That's called dirty spec. It's called a dirty spec, and it doesn't. It's not actually a dirty thing. It's actually kind of a smart thing. So essentially, there are key points on the bike that most people will gravitate towards. If it's got an XT rear derailleur, most people are going to think that's an XT drivetrain. You can't really identify a cassette for most cases based on what it is, or a chain. And so putting an XT derailleur on a bike that has Dior components on the rest of it is a way to add some pop to that bike, make it a little bit more, put a little more incentive in it. And it's a hard-working component, right? Like having a nice derailleur does make a big difference on a bike. And then down-speccing the rest of the bike allows the bike company to hit price points, because most bike companies build bikes to price points. They're trying to hit a particular audience and service a different, price point. That's why you've got, a model of a bike with like 5 different types of builds on it, from 2,500 to 8,500.
Parking lot test. Best way to figure out how a bike rides, but what are some things people should do when that's their way of testing out a bike?
It's a good question. I think a parking lot test, I always encourage it, but it's never a really great gauge of a bike. I mean, if it's a bike you're going to pedal around the cul-de-sac, you can probably get a good real world test in a parking lot. If it's a bike that you intend to take out to Tiger Mountain or Raging River or Duthie or something, you're probably not going to get all of the information that you need out of a parking lot test. I think a parking lot test serves a couple of functions. One, it helps to identify, is this bike too big or small for me? If I feel really awkward on this thing, or like something doesn't reach, that's where you're generally going to find it. Number two, how does it feel when I pedal it? Like if I'm going to play around on the bike, if I dance around on trails and what, can I do that in a parking lot? Sure. It's not going to be exactly the same, but it gives you a taste. Do I like this ice cream or not? I can definitely identify that, through a spoonful. And so I think a parking lot test is good for those situations. What I would recommend, if somebody really wants to get a feel for a bike, especially if you're buying an expensive bike through $3,000, $4,000, $6,000, $7,000, $8,000, see if you can get on a demo or a rental, right? Most shops these days have a demo program in place. All bike brands, for the most part, have a demo program in place. You're going to be maybe a little bit more hard-pressed these days because of COVID. Like Evo, for instance, we're not running our demo program this year. It would have been an exceptionally late start. And for all the various other reasons, we decided not to go that route. But a demo is going to give you a better feel for it. If you can take it out for a day and ride it on the trail that you're hoping to ride it on, or a trail, you're going to have a better experience and a better sense of whether that bike is the right fit for you.
What are some common misconceptions that you see people come in with when they go to buy a bike?
Let's see. More travel is better. I think we've identified that a couple times here. That's not the case at all. In fact, in many situations, it could be just the opposite. What else? I can't ride X bike on Y trails. There may be some truth in that, depending on what you're talking about, but I think a lot of people have ideas in their brain that are maybe just not accurate in terms of where bikes can be ridden. Depends on the rider, the trail, all kinds of various circumstances. One that I hear quite a bit is, why does that, especially lately in the last few years, why does that bike only have one ring up front? I need 2 or 3. And so for those that don't know, what they're getting at there is a single ring or a 1-by, is what we call it in the industry setup, versus a standard dual or a triple chain ring up front, right? You think more gears, it's better. What I think is being overlooked there is that really the question needs to be asked is, what is your gear ratio? Like your gear combination between your front rings and your rear rings. And now that you've got cassettes that go up to 52 teeth, right? I mean, it's at some point, is the circumference of that cassette going to overshadow the circumference of the wheel, and we'll just be rolling around on cogs?
You have great grip then. I mean, that cassette will just grip right onto the trail. It'll cut through anything.
Yeah. So I mean, that's definitely one I hear. And today's bikes, in most situations, I'd say maybe aside from your loyalist hardcore road racer, most people are going to get as good a gear ratio as a triple or a double setup on a one by, and it's going to be a lot easier to maintain. It's going to be a lot easier to ride. In some cases, it's lower cost. So, or riding bikes is not safe. That tends to be what my mom thinks, and probably for fair reason, considering the amount of ER visits I've had. So that's fair.
So what about this? I've got a new bike. I've found my way out to the trails, been riding it a bunch. How long can I go before I need to take it into the shop for a tune-up?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So most shops will give you a free or very, very slightly, low charge 30 to 45 day tune-up. So obviously, just like anything else, when you buy a new bike and it gets put all together, as you ride it, things start to settle in. Perceived cable stretch, maybe the derailleur is slightly off now and things aren't shifting as crisply as when you first got it, or you discover that you've got maybe a squishy brake because there's maybe an air bubble in there. 30 to 45 days, you should always, if you're not comfortable doing it yourself, always take it back to your local bike shop and have them take a look at it. Most cases, they'll do that for you for free because there's generally not a lot that needs to be done there. No major repairs in most cases that need to be taken care of, but it's a good way just to shake out the cobwebs and make sure the bike is in good shape and is functioning as it was intended to when they sent you out the door.
All right. Well, one other thing I want to touch on, we'll cover some of this here at the end, and maybe people watching this in a few months from now will be like, oh, COVID, that's the thing of the past. It's all over. But right now we kind of live in a COVID world. How is a bike shop functioning differently, and specifically what should a customer expect or anticipate looking for a bike in the times we are in right now?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So I think there's been a lot of misinformation around that. So bike shops in most areas, not all, but in most areas, we're fortunate enough to be deemed essential businesses, right? Just purely for the mode of transportation that it provides to a lot of people. That's been a blessing to our industry. So we're all very, very thankful that a lot of those people, shops are able to stay open and people have their jobs. In terms of what they need to know when they go into the shops, well, I'd start with this, standard protocol these days, right? Like social distancing is going to be enforced. Always wear a mask. It's going to be enforced. Depending on obviously it's going to vary state to state, depending, or even city to city, county to county, depending on the laws. So abide by those first. Beyond that, I think you're in good shape if you call ahead of time. You're going to be the industry right now is seeing the biggest boom that it has, at least in my lifetime and in most, if not all lifetimes, ever seen. We've never seen this kind of a boom in sales, in service. I mean, it's absolutely insane and beautiful right now to see how many people are getting on bikes. But it's caused its own amount of strains from available inventory is at an all-time low. I mean, there's a lot of, it's very difficult to get price point bikes now. It's very difficult to get service in a timely manner right now, depending on where you go. It's hard to find parts, even for myself, like to try and buy stuff to have in stock. So call ahead. You're going to do yourself a world of good by calling ahead and just saying, hey, I want to come in and look at a new bike, or I need to bring my bike in for service. Is today a good day? If not, can I schedule a time? You may encounter wait times. Some stores, including Evo, are going to limit how many people can be in the store at once. So it's kind of all the stuff that we're already starting to get used to when we're out in public. I think that's probably the best bet and place to start. But I think at the bottom line is be patient right now. You're not going to get everything you want in terms of components, accessories, bikes. Inventory is very, very, very spotty right now, all over the place. And that will change once supply chain kind of revamps and gets itself back into good shape. But right now I know a lot of people are searching for X, Y, or Z and not able to find it. And so we're going to have to be patient. We're going to have to be flexible. That's what I'd recommend to people.
Yeah, I know for me right now, I'm taking it a little bit easier to some degree because, I don't want to break myself, but I also don't want to break my bike because I broke my bike. It's gonna be hard to find another one right now.
It is. It's really an amazing time to be a part of the industry or to be a consumer trying to get into it, right? Like, and it's great. I mean, there's nothing better than getting this many people on bikes, but it's got its own unique set of challenges.
All right. Well, Jon Kennedy from Evo, really appreciate your time. Any final words, thoughts?
No, I would say, hey, if you're interested in riding, by all means, reach out to somebody at Evo or your local bike shop. I mean, all of these bike shops are doing an amazing job right now of keeping people up and rolling and riding. We're all so excited to see how many new people are coming into the sport and giving it a shot. My hope is that demand keeps up and that people keep riding. And, there's a lot of joy to be had on a bike. So I'm excited to see more people get out there. It's great.
Thanks, Jon. See you on the trails.
Yeah, see you there.